You're about to hear the tale of a man so exceptional, so unique in his accomplishments, and so impactful on the course of history that if it hadn't been so well documented from so many different historical perspectives, you'd be justified in considering it essentially unbelievable. A man who made both Caesar and Napoleon feel humbled in comparison. A man whose energy and sheer force of will practically has no equal in recorded history, and who, perhaps even more impressively, wasn't just a conqueror par excellence, but unlike other great men in this category, such as Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun, he was a figure who seemed to be a man of wisdom, learning, nobility of spirit, and magnanimity. It's one thing to be able to inspire terror in one's foes and cause them to fall seemingly effortlessly, like a series of dominoes collapsing under their own gravity. It's another to be able to inspire genuine love and admiration in the process, to the extent that your men are willing to die for you at a moment's notice, and opponents are forever willing to compromise when they see all is likely lost, knowing they'll be dealt with honestly and justly. And this latter bit is key. Those great conquerors who lacked this sense of tact and diplomacy and good graces so often eventually found themselves opposed, desperately, by massive forces with sky-high morale and firm sense of purpose, knowing what would happen to their women and children, their nation, and all future generations should they lose. It's what stopped Attila in his tracks at long last, and what prevented the Mongols succeeding in their similarly relentless push westward. Alexander the Great's empire would eventually stretch across the majority of the, quote, civilized world. And if not for his untimely death in 323 BC, at the young age of 32, one wonders how profoundly different the world's trajectory might have been. From the moment of his birth, the stars seemed to be aligned in his favor. Born to an accomplished King Philip, an impressive conqueror and geopolitical strategist in his own right, who believed he might potentially muster the power to unify the entire Hellenic world, and born in the nearly perfect location of Macedonia, stretched between the Scythian and Gothic peoples to his north and east, and a declining Greece to his south, everything about his entry into this world spoke to favorable conditions for a personality of his type. And from the very beginning, he showed unique potential. Plutarch tells us, while he was yet very young, he entertained the ambassadors from the king of Persia, in the absence of his father, and entering much into conversation with them, gained so much upon them by his affability and the questions he asked them, which were far from being childish or trifling, for he inquired of them the length of the ways, the nature of the road into Inner Asia, the character of their king, how he carried himself to his enemies, and what forces he was able to bring into the field, that they were struck with admiration of him, and looked upon the ability so much famed of Philip to be nothing in comparison with the forwardness and high purpose that appeared thus early in his son. Whenever he heard Philip had taken any town of importance or won any signal victory, instead of rejoicing at it altogether, he would tell his companions that his father would anticipate everything, and leave him and them no opportunities of performing great and illustrious actions. For, being more bent upon action and glory than either upon pleasure or riches, he esteemed all that he should receive from his father as a diminution and prevention of his own future achievements, and would have chosen rather to succeed to a kingdom involved in troubles and wars, which would have afforded him frequent exercise of his courage and a large field of honor, than to one already flourishing and settled, where his inheritance would be an inactive life and the mere enjoyment of wealth and luxury." End quote. He would be personally tutored by Aristotle, one of the greatest minds of his age, or any other for that matter, and raised on the greatest works of literature of the day, showing a special love for Homer and his masterful Iliad. And a simple story of his early years illustrates clearly just what type of budding personality this was. A Thessalian horse trader was showing his wares to King Philip. Among them was a large black stallion that had proven so utterly unmanageable that he was said to be a danger to his own handlers. Naturally, Philip turned down the animal. But the keen eye of the then 13-year-old Alexander had noticed that the horse was not malicious, but rather scared of his own shadow. The boy called out a challenge to the men, mocking them for losing out on such a great horse because they lacked the skill to handle him. Philip rebuked him, but Alexander persisted. So, father and son made a wager on the exorbitant price of the horse, dependent on whether Alexander could handle him. The young boy took the horse, turned him from his shadow, and mounted up, galloping effortlessly around the arena. Philip was immensely proud, and is recorded to have remarked that Alexander would have to seek a kingdom greater than his own, for Macedonia would not be big enough for him. This horse, whom Alexander was to name Bucephalus, was to go on to become perhaps the most famous horse in history, and remain by his side in nearly every major battle until their final days. It's said the horse refused all other riders besides Alexander, and the king was devoted to his horse. Once, while in the land of the Uxians, the locals had raided the Macedonian camp and made away with goods and livestock, including Bucephalus. Alexander had a proclamation sent out promising to kill every last inhabitant of the land if his horse was not returned. The threat was taken with absolute seriousness, and the bandits quickly surrendered their prize to save their lives. And though Philip may have indeed voiced the sentiment that Macedonia would not be enough for Alexander, the man who raised the future conqueror and set the stage for his dominance was an impressive leader and tactician in his own right. Learning from experience, he'd made several changes and refinements to his army, especially in the context of allowing for more mobility, greater agility, and flexibility. This, coupled with their unique training and drilling, caused, quote, the army to move so quickly from point to point that the enemy often couldn't believe that they'd arrived. With the help of his elite companion cavalry, derived from those noble and aristocratic families of the age, with enough money to outfit them and sufficient free time to properly train, these blitzkrieg-style tactics began to be honed to perfection. By 18, Alexander was already leading an attack against the Thebans at the head of a portion of Philip's army, while Philip simultaneously attacked Athens. Both were successful. The relationship between Philip and Alexander certainly wasn't wholly free from tension, especially after Philip set Alexander's mother, Olympias, aside in favor of a niece of one of his generals named Cleopatra. Tension soon boiled over during the wedding celebrations, to the extent that a very much drunken Philip actually pulled his sword on Alexander, only to then fall sprawling to the floor, leading Alexander to remark, "Here is the man you would have lead you against the Persians. He stumbles jumping from one seat to the next." These tensions would soon be compounded with the naming of Cleopatra's first child, Philip. And yet, Philip seemed to love and respect Alexander, and sincerely desire that Alexander be his successor. So much so that he wanted him by his side at a royal wedding celebration in 338 BC. It was during these festivities that Pausanias, the captain of Philip's royal bodyguard, stabbed the king in the heart and killed him. Pausanias' motives were never established, though it is highly likely that he was in Persian pay. But either way, he was killed trying to escape. Whatever the reasons for his actions, Philip was dead, and Alexander was proclaimed king by Philip's generals and the leading men in Macedonia. At age 20, he was now ruler of Macedon and hegemon of the League of Corinth. A legendary encounter took place in Corinth in his early years. Alexander, who through his tutelage by Aristotle had developed an admiration for wise men, approached Diogenes and asked him if the king of Macedon might do anything for him. It's said that Diogenes, who was sitting in the public square at the time, sourly looked up at him and told Alexander that he could get out of his son. It's said that this remark produced a good-natured laugh, and prompted Alexander to later say, "If I could not be Alexander, I would be Diogenes." Plutarch would later write that, by some strange twist of fate, Alexander and Diogenes would go on to die on the exact same day, in 323 BC. At the age of 21, his first major action is to quell rebellions, presumably by peoples willing to take the risk to test the mettle of the new king. Alexander chose to teach them a quick and brutal lesson, perhaps in part to broadcast to the world that he was at least his father's equal, and not a pushover to be tested or trifled with. He no doubt knew that if his ambitions extended so far afield, he'd need to do everything in his power to secure already conquered lands, and avoid these types of rebellions in the future. Though the stars may have been aligned for young Alexander in many ways, economically speaking, they certainly were not. And yet this didn't slow him in the least. Despite objections from advisors, despite Macedon being virtually bankrupt, he borrowed as much money as he could lay hands on, just enough to supply his men for approximately 1 month, and promptly heads east. Bold would be an understatement, but such was his confidence in his men, their training, his own abilities as a leader, and his general read of the geopolitical situation, that I doubt he hesitated even for a moment. Before he began to conquer in earnest, we find yet another legendary encounter, this time in Phrygia, with the infamous Gordian knot, said to be an intricate and complex series of tightly bound rope knots that an oracle had prophesied would be unbound only by a man destined to become ruler of all Asia. Accounts differ here. Most accounts claim either Alexander pulled out a linchpin to untangle the mass, or simply took a sword to it and sliced it in half. Both are believable, and the story itself, if true, and it seems to be, seems to speak to two aspects of Alexander's personality. Firstly, his unwillingness to be daunted by any obstacle whatsoever. Secondly, his respect for legends, myths, and those types of storylines underlying and running through all history, and his understanding of their power over the public consciousness. As Alexander headed east with his new army, there's no doubt who his initial target was. It was Darius and his Achaemenid Empire that was foremost in his sights. There exists a fascinating, and for some reason still little-known, letter written to Darius from Alexander that speaks volumes about the real situation on the ground, and hints at the likely geopolitical machinations occurring in Persia, Greece, and Macedon at the time. Though the letter may have been addressed to Darius, and though Darius was technically the ruler, it seems his rulership was likely that of a mere puppet, and that the empire had been essentially taken over by some of the most obviously ignoble schemers and murderers in the entirety of the ancient historical record, foremost of whom was a wealthy merchant named Bagoas, who had somehow managed to worm his way into the position of kingmaker. Alexander begins, "Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and the rest of Greece and did us harm, although we had not done you any previous injury." He wrote that Darius helped the people of Perinthus to fight against his father Philip. Not only this, but Alexander also blamed Darius for the assassination of Philip. He then accuses Darius of killing his own predecessor and usurping the Persian throne. Quote, "You killed Arses with the help of Bagoas, and gained your throne through unjust means in defiance of Persian custom." And Darius does indeed seem to have been an obscure figure of questionable lineage. And yet it seems almost certain that Bagoas was the main instigator here. This wealthy and powerful court merchant had poisoned the rightful ruler, Artaxerxes III, and installed his son Arses in his place, only to soon poison him as well, placing Darius on the throne. It seems Darius too may have refused to cooperate with his every whim, so apparently, in short order, he attempted to poison Darius as well. The legend goes that this time his plans were discovered, and Darius summoned Bagoas to drink a toast to him, from the very same cup he prepared for Darius, resulting in his death. This revolting little scoundrel, Bagoas, is the tip of the iceberg with regard to the treachery and deceit and sordid intrigue that seem to take over this entire region like a dark cloud around this period of time. Alexander's disgust here seemed very much justified. His letter to Darius continues, "Your envoys corrupted my men and sought to destroy the peace which I established amongst the Greeks." This is an intriguing line, and it's a shame we don't have further elaboration. But again, one has to believe Alexander was likely justified. Dating back to approximately 500 BC, the historical record with regard to the Persians, Medians, and Chaldeans becomes so strangely muddled and confused, replete with multiple usurpations, not just of thrones, but even of names and identities, exemplified by the case of Bardia, of the so-called false Smerdis, in which a Magian priest is said to have pretended to be the rightful ruler, until the ruse was eventually discovered and he was killed. Though even these details aren't the least bit certain or clear. And in fact, it may even be that this supposed false Smerdis was indeed the rightful inheritor of power, and this story, created for posterity, was the real deception. In short, something very strange and very dark was transpiring at the highest levels, and this coinciding with images of rulers shown on coins of the era, beginning to show a very different racial or ethnic type rising to prominence. And to this very day, conventional history seems as muddled as ever as to the truth behind it all. And finally, Alexander concludes his letter forcefully, wishing to leave no doubt as to the true nature of the power dynamic between the two men. "In the future, whenever you communicate with me, send to me as the king of Asia. Do not write to me as an equal." In his letter, Alexander emphasized that Darius should meet him in person in order to negotiate any future settlement. But it's said that Darius was too frightened to meet face to face. And so, after winning several battles in quick succession and liberating a number of cities from Persian rule, Alexander and Darius finally met face to face on the field of battle instead. Their first meeting would be in the Battle of Issus in southern Anatolia in November of 333 BC, with Alexander's approximately 37,000 Macedonians outnumbered at least 2-1. Though some estimates put the total number in the Persian retinue at approximately 500,000. Though the Persians experienced some early success in the battle, the Macedonians were undoubtedly the superior force, with vastly superior leadership and organization, and the companion cavalry quickly took control of the engagement, with Alexander himself at their head, personally crashing through enemy lines in pursuit of a frightened Darius, only to be forced to turn back, seeing his left and center flanks in trouble, and riding to assist. Such was the slaughter on that day, that Alexander and his bodyguards, as they again set out in direct pursuit of Darius, were able to cross a ravine, according to accounts, atop the piled bodies of dead Persians. Alexander had scored a decisive and dominant victory, and personally chased his disgraced foe from the battlefield. And while Darius managed to evade his grasp, he'd fled so quickly that much of his family was left behind, leading to the capture of his wife, his mother, and his 2 daughters. Their ultimate score would need to be settled another day, but the tone had been set. However, before he resumed his push eastward, Alexander's conquering force moved south toward Egypt. In 332 BC, when Alexander the Great was laying siege to Tyre, a city in present-day Lebanon, he received yet another letter from Darius. Darius's tone changed from whining and justifications to an offer. In his new letter, he proposed to offer 3 gifts to Alexander to end the enmity between the 2 empires. A ransom of 10,000 drachma in exchange for his captured family, all territory to the west of the Euphrates River, and his daughter's hand in marriage. So attractive was the offer that Parmenion, a competent general who'd served his father well for many years, who was 44 years older than Alexander, and thus very much in a different season of life, is said to have stated, "Were I Alexander, I would accept." To which Alexander is said to have responded, "So would I, were I Parmenion." Alexander continued the siege, demolishing Tyre, with Darius and his entire Persian Empire now squarely in his sights. Arrian, in his work The Anabasis of Alexander, written in the 2nd century AD, gives us this insightful, almost poetic take. Quote, "As for the exact thoughts in Alexander's mind, I am neither able nor concerned to guess them, but this I think I can state, that nothing common or mean would have been his intention. He would not have remained content with any of his conquests, not even if he had added the British Isles to Europe. He would always have searched beyond, or something unknown, and if there had been no other competition, he would have competed against himself." End quote. Having defeated Tyre, followed by a southern push deep into Egypt, conquering Memphis, Ammon, and overrunning and bestowing his name on what would become the wealthy and powerful port city of Alexandria, he now pushed eastward toward what was to be the final decisive battle with Darius at Gaugamela, near modern Iraq. Alexander's force of approximately 45,000 men were facing down an army that certainly dwarfed them, though the numbers are still hotly debated. Arrian, Plutarch, and Siculus all claim there were approximately 1 million men in total, though Curtius Rufus puts the number at closer to 250,000. Modern historians tend to claim it was closer to 100,000 men. At the very least, Alexander was once again outnumbered more than 2 to 1, with his cavalry outnumbered more than 5 to 1, greatly increasing the danger of being flanked. Though I suspect he was, once again, completely undaunted, and simply eager for the fray. Darius had attempted to prepare ahead this time, and engaged in scorched earth tactics along Alexander's most likely route. Alexander simply sidestepped this trap, opting for a more northerly route, arriving unaffected with a healthy force. It's said that the battle was fierce, but Alexander's decision to again charge directly for Darius with his best men caused complete disarray among the sprawling mercenary force of Persia. There's some debate as to whether Darius's army abandoned him, or the more widely accepted view that Darius himself again turned tail and fled in a frightened haste. And again, Alexander was hot on his heels. But having apparently received a desperate message from his trusted general Parmenion, who'd been encircled by Persian cavalry and needed immediate help, Alexander once again had to give up the personal chase. As word spread that Darius had fled the field, the battle was clearly decided. And yet again, Alexander had administered a crushing, dominant defeat, despite the long odds. The shift in the balance of power was now clear for all to see. There was a new predominant force on the world stage. Darius had already been living amidst a dangerous sea of intrigue and scheming and power-hungry opportunists. But now, having lost 2 major battles and fled the battlefield in disgrace, his hold on power had never been more tenuous. Open rebellion now stirred, led by 2 figures named Nabarzanes and Bessus. Darius was now in a hopeless position, but faced with the choice of the great conqueror or the traitors in his midst, he seems to have preferred that the empire fall to Alexander. He's said to have communicated to Bessus that, quote, he had as much evidence of Alexander's sense of justice as of his courage, and any who expected a reward for betrayal from him were mistaken. None would be a more severe avenger or punisher of treason than Alexander. End quote. Despite his captivity, Darius was destined to have some vindication, for his assertion that Alexander would despise the treacherous generals would be proven true. Upon encountering deserters and learning of Darius's imprisonment, Alexander and a small force of the most physically fit men in his army tore across the countryside on horseback, intent on catching the Persians. When Bessus and Nabarzanes learned of Alexander's impending arrival, they went to the wagon serving as Darius's prison and tried to convince the king to mount a horse and run with them to escape Alexander. Darius, however, declared that the gods had come to avenge him, and, calling for Alexander's protection, refused to go along with the traitors. In a fury, they speared their king many times and left him for dead in the cart. They also wounded the animals so that they couldn't carry Darius away. Alexander's men would later stumble upon the dying Darius by sheer chance. Upon Darius's request, they brought him some water from the stream, and, quote, he then desired that the following message should be given to Alexander. That, quote, he died without having done him any acts of kindness, but a debtor to him for the greatest, since he had found his feelings towards his mother and children to be those of a prince, not of a foe. That he had been more happy in his enemy than in his relations, for by his enemy life had been granted to his mother and children, but taken from himself by his relatives, to whom he had given both life and kingdoms, and that such a requital must therefore be made them as his conqueror should please. For himself, that he made the only return to Alexander which he could at the point of death, by praying to the gods above and below, and the powers that protected kings, that the empire of the world might fall to his lot. End quote. Some accounts indicate that Alexander arrived before Darius had died, received the Persian king's final blessing in person, and swore to Darius that he would avenge his death. Either way, upon seeing the great king of Persia come to such an end, it's said that Alexander was grieved to the point of tears. He covered the body with his own cloak and ordered that Darius's body be returned to Persepolis to lie in state, before being honored with a full Persian funeral and laid to rest among his royal ancestors. Alexander then pursued and executed Bessus for betraying his own king. Some say he was killed in that infamous old method of being tied between two trees, bent heavily and secured in place, and when the securing ropes were cut, as the trees powerfully swung back to their natural position, his body was ripped in two. A powerful will is often the mark of a great man. Being able to fully harness and control that will is the mark of a still greater. Alexander was objectively exceptional in this regard, and his accomplishments objectively testify to this better than mere sophistry or argumentation ever could. But there were moments in which he loosed these reins and let himself go. One, in particular, that likely haunted him, to some degree, until his final days. A rift was developing between he and some of his men, who, in my personal opinion, both had valid points. The Macedonians, naturally, felt great nationalistic pride in their accomplishments. They'd finally overcome the great enemy of all Greeks, and wanted the Persians to feel the weight of their boot, to suffer all the usual indignities of a defeated party, who once boasted so proudly and brazenly. Alexander no doubt felt this too, but he also seemed very aware of the more ancient racial and cultural ties that connected these two peoples, and nearly all that lay between them and the vast swath of territory they just conquered. And moreover, he was a leader and conqueror at heart, not just magnanimous by nature, but also strategically so. He knew that by showing respect to the conquered, he'd not only reduce the chance of rebellions or assassination attempts, but also find willing and eager recruits to continue his push wherever and whenever he might choose. His willingness to adopt various Persian customs had stirred discontent, specifically that of obeisance, which, for the Macedonians, was meant for the gods alone. In their eyes, this was Oriental servility, and as much as they loved their leader, in their minds this crossed a line. A Macedonian named Cleitus, who it said had saved Alexander's life at Gaugamela, apparently brutally insulted one of Alexander's Persian courtiers in his presence, causing frayed tempers, eventually resulting in Alexander taking a spear to Cleitus in what's been called a drunken brawl, and running him through. Tortured with remorse, it's said that Alexander took to his rooms and didn't emerge for several days. And there would be one more unfortunate twist of fate shortly after. A banquet was held with dignitaries from all across his new empire in attendance. Among them were Corhagus, a strong Macedonian warrior, and Dioxippus, a former Athenian boxer. It should be noted that Athens is sometimes slighted, next to Sparta, with regard to their martial prowess, yet this doesn't seem to be wholly justified. Several accounts speak to an elite ruling class, or caste, whether these were the Phryans that the Oralinda book seems to insinuate, or the Hyperboreans, as mentioned by Diodorus Siculus, as being especially prominent in Athens and Delia. There's no doubt that such a class existed, and from this class seemed to spring not just the leaders and wise men, but several great warriors, and their resulting feats of valor. Alexander himself was quite fond of Dioxippus the Athenian, but the jealous Macedonians would often disparage him, apparently calling him a bloated animal, and saying that while they went into battle, he was, quote, dripping with oil and preparing for a banquet. Growing more and more intoxicated as the night went on, Corhagus began to repeat these insults, and he finally insisted on challenging Dioxippus to a duel the following day, and to let Alexander then be the judge of whether Corhagus was reckless or Dioxippus was a coward. Dioxippus contemptuously accepted the challenge, and even after both had sobered up the following day, they remained eager for the contest. The date was set for their match, and the Greeks among the army eagerly backed Dioxippus, while the Macedonians were confident of Corhagus's victory. On the day of the fight, it's said the army came out in droves to watch. Corhagus had donned all of his expensive armor and carried a spear, club, and sword, while Dioxippus appeared fully naked and oiled, carrying only a club. His lack of armor served only to heighten the excitement and tension, as many thought him a fool to appear as he did before a fully armed and armored Macedonian soldier. Diodorus described the fight. Quote, as they approached each other, the Macedonian flung his javelin from a proper distance, but the other inclined his body slightly and avoided its impact. Then the Macedonian poised his long lance and charged, but the Greek, when he came within reach, struck the spear with his club and shattered it. After these two defeats, Corhagus was reduced to continuing the battle with his sword. But as he reached for it, the other leaped upon him and seized his sword hand with his left, while with his right hand, the Greek upset the Macedonian's balance and made him lose his footing. As he fell to the earth, Dioxippus placed his foot upon his neck, and, holding his club aloft, looked to the spectators. End quote. Alexander signaled for Dioxippus to release Corhagus, and then dismissed those present, apparently quite annoyed that the Macedonian had failed so spectacularly against a Greek, particularly before foreign dignitaries. This little sideshow had unfortunate ramifications, as Alexander recognized. After such an incredible string of uninterrupted military successes, this single and very public duel might actually dispel some of the awe and fear that the Macedonian phalanx had so justly inspired in its enemies. Alexander, to his shame, apparently became increasingly brusque and hostile toward Dioxippus, and all of the Macedonians of the court became even more jealous and bitter. They framed Dioxippus for thievery by hiding a golden cup under his pillow, and then publicly accused and humiliated him at the next banquet symposium. Seeing all the Macedonians arrayed against him, Dioxippus gave up trying to plead his case and left the feast. In his rooms, he wrote Alexander a letter explaining his innocence, sent it to the king by way of servants, and then killed himself. Despite his own poor treatment of the man, Alexander was said to be greatly aggrieved when he read the letter and learned of Dioxippus' death, and he was angry with those who had driven him to such despair. In the east, Alexander reformed his army and took into his special forces mainly peoples belonging to the Sakai and Scythian tribes. A strong early tradition existed in Europe that the Saxons had been soldiers in Alexander's armies. And it's true that from the Sakai almost certainly descend the Anglo-Saxons and related peoples. This tradition was frequently mentioned in the time of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and is spoken of in detail in a history of Holland written in 1601 by a Jean-François Le Petit, who speaks to that frequently occurring storyline of three brothers living in and around India, and names one of these as Frizzo, the same Frizzo mentioned in the Orlinda book. The OLB speaks to the cooperation of Frizzo's people with Alexander, but also voices the opinion that arrogance seemed to be his driving force in his final days. It's interesting that Taxila seems to be cognate with the Texland of the Orlinda book. And Taxila was certainly one of the centers of power that seems to have been established in a strategic location by an Aryan people as of around 1500 to 1000 BC. As Alexander entered the area, the ruler of Taxila was said to have been the first to approach him cordially. Upon meeting Alexander, he asked, "To what purpose should we make war upon one another? If the design of your coming into these parts be not to rob us of our water or our necessary food, which are the only things that wise men are indispensably obliged to fight for. As for other riches and possessions, as they are accounted in the eye of the world, if I am better provided of them than you, I am ready to let you share with me. But if fortune has been more liberal to you than me, I have no objection to be obliged to you." This discourse pleased Alexander so much that, embracing him, he's said to have stated, "Do you think your kind words and courteous behavior will bring you off in this interview without a contest? No, you shall not escape so. I shall contend and do battle with you so far that, how obliging soever you are, you shall not have the better of me." End quote. Then, receiving some presents from him, he returned him others of still greater value, and, to complete his bounty, gave him in money ready coined 1,000 talents. Alexander then entered a region called Aornus to tackle an infamous and virtually impenetrable rock fortress connected to the legendary Hercules, whom Alexander claimed as a personal ancestor. Though immensely difficult and somewhat costly, the young Macedonians' creative tactics and sheer force of will wouldn't be denied, and soon Alexander was master of the rock that had, supposedly, defeated Heracles. They then moved on to Nysa, which claimed to have been founded by Dionysus. After sending out a wise man or sage to plead their case to the conqueror, it's said that Alexander was pleased and asked only for horsemen from the army, but otherwise left the city safe and independent. In 326 BC, Alexander was to come face to face with Porus, and the largest army he'd faced since the defeat of Darius at Gaugamela. Tens of thousands strong, and containing the famed and greatly feared war elephants. Alexander's men, however, at this stage were some of the most experienced and battle-hardened in history, and they'd planned for this. As the elephants charged, they simply opened up their battle lines, let them pass through, and then descended in mass to spear the riders from the beasts. Porus, said to have been a giant of a man, was universally accounted to have led competently and fought with extraordinary courage, as was Porus's relative and foremost ally in the fight, named Spartacus, which seems to have been of direct lineage with the Spitamid clan, from which the famed Zoroaster descended. Arrian's account tells us Porus had played a distinguished role in the battle, not only as commander-in-chief but also as a fine soldier. Faced with the slaughter of his cavalry, his elephants either dead on the field or wandering in a pitiful state after the loss of their drivers, and most of his infantry killed, he still kept fighting on as long as there was any Indian unit holding together sufficiently to offer resistance. It was only when he was wounded that he finally turned his elephant and began his own withdrawal. Alexander dearly wanted to save the life of a great man he had seen fight a noble battle. Other historians have credited Porus's elephant, which apparently took particular care of the king and defended him fiercely in the battle. Plutarch says that while Porus rode from the field, he took many wounds from the Macedonians, who rained arrows on him. When Porus began to weaken from his wounds, the elephant knelt to the ground to prevent him from falling, and the elephant even allegedly began to carefully pull out the arrows with his own trunk. Curtius claimed that the animal fought to the death to protect Porus, for he would not allow anyone to touch Porus after he was overcome by his wounds, and had to be killed before any man could get near to the Indian king. Porus was brought before Alexander, and upon exchanging words, the two men formed a deep mutual respect. Alexander not only granted Porus continued rule over his former lands, but even gave him greater territory from the regions that he had conquered, more than doubling Porus's original holdings. For his part, it's said that Porus remained unswervingly loyal to the Macedonian king for the remainder of his days. It's probable that few generals have pushed their men to their limits to the extent that Alexander did. The number of battles fought, where the Macedonians often greatly outnumbered, the amount of distance covered, often in difficult terrain and in largely unknown and hostile territory in which any local could suddenly prove to be an enemy. As much as they loved and respected their leader, with no end to their journey in sight, many seemed to finally be at their breaking point. Hearing of the unrest, Alexander gathered his men together and addressed them as a body, assuring them of the riches and glory to come, and begging them to continue to follow him. Curtius gave an account of the discussion. Quote, "Not even this could force a response from any of the men, who were waiting for their generals and officers to report to the king that they were exhausted from their wounds and the relentless hardship of the campaign, that they were not evading their responsibilities but unable to fulfill them. Little by little, their feelings of sadness began to gain freer expression, and tears started to flow. So much so that the king's anger turned to pity, and he was, despite himself, unable to keep the tears from his own eyes. Finally, when the entire assembly was said to be weeping profusely, Coinus ventured to approach the tribunal, while the others all hung back, and he indicated his desire to speak. "May the gods keep disloyal thoughts from us," Coinus declared, "and indeed they do so. Your men are willing as ever to go wherever you command, to fight, to face danger, to shed our blood in order to transmit your name to posterity. So, if you are going on, we shall follow or go before you wherever you wish, even though we be unarmed, naked and exhausted. But if you are prepared to hear the sincere words of your soldiers, wrung out of them by dire necessity, then please lend a sympathetic ear to men who have unfailingly followed your orders and your leadership, and will continue to do so wherever you go. But will you expose this fine army naked to wild beasts? Why strive for glory by a circuitous route when it sits so close at hand? Here, too, you face the ocean. Unless you prefer aimless wandering, we have reached the point to which your fortune has been leading you." When Coinus concluded his speech, shouting and weeping arose all around him, the mingled cries of the men declaring Alexander their king, their father, their lord. Angered by their persistence and uncertain what to do, Alexander jumped down from the platform where he had been speaking and concluded the meeting for the day. The following day he reconvened the men, but he was still angry. And as he dismissed them, he insisted that if they desired to turn back, they should do so. He would remain, with or without them, and find those who would support him, including the Persian soldiers, once enemies, who now gave him their allegiance. Any who wished to go home were free to do so, and they could tell their friends back in Macedonia that they had returned alone, leaving their king surrounded by enemies. After this, he shut himself in his tent, allowing none to enter besides his usual servants and attendants, not even his close friends. He remained there for 2 days, and on the 3rd day finally emerged. Apparently, now placated, Alexander announced to their great joy that they were heading home, and he ordered his men to mark this easternmost point with 12 large altars of stone. The army then began the laborious task of retracing their steps back to the Hydaspes River and the new cities of Bucephala and Nicaea. And they did indeed begin to head in the direction of home, but this didn't mean the battles were over. Alexander still had the Malians and the Brahmins to deal with, the 2 remaining holdouts standing in the way of their total dominance in the region. By this point, Alexander had split his army into several smaller portions, each commanded by one of his top generals. They swept through the land, clearing all remaining resistance from the Malians. The only remaining holdout was a group that had sought sanctuary in a city belonging to the Brahmins. They moved quickly to the city and prepared for a final confrontation with the last remaining members of the Malian tribe. When the assault began, Alexander ordered his men to set their siege ladders against the fortress wall, but they hesitated, unwilling to lose their lives in what seemed to be another unnecessary battle, this one against a strongly fortified enemy city. When he could not convince his men to climb, Alexander jumped onto the ladders himself and climbed to the top of the wall, ignoring the arrows that were being rained down by defenders. Alexander reached the top of the battlements and cleared a path through the defenders, cutting down some with his sword and knocking others off the wall by battering them with his shield. Realizing that he was utterly exposed, alone, and tiring, he made the decision to jump down into the fort itself, hoping that he could strike fear into the Malians, or, failing that, at least die a noble death. Landing on his feet, Alexander found an old tree near the wall, and used it to protect his back as he faced down the onslaught of the Malians, who now realized that the Macedonian king stood alone within their walls. The first few to rush at Alexander were quickly disposed of by the conqueror, including the Malian leader himself, according to Arrian's account, after which none dared attack him directly, but instead stayed at a distance, flinging spears and arrows. Alexander managed to block these with his shield and effectively defend himself, until one Malian managed to hit him with a 4-foot arrow that lodged itself along his right side. The initial wound lost him a massive amount of blood and dropped him to his knees. He still managed to defend himself, but he was growing weaker every moment until he finally collapsed on his shield. Thinking him dead, the man who shot the arrow ran up to strip the body and claim his victory. But this act motivated Alexander once again, and he managed to lift his sword and bury it in his attacker's side. He tried to lift himself to his feet by holding onto the tree limb, but he sank back to his knees. Still defiant, the accounts claim he gestured to the surrounding Malians to come finish their attack, determined to go down fighting. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the army had fallen into chaos. No matter what their feelings on the campaign as a whole, the men still adored Alexander. Seeing their king disappearing over the battlements, they began to panic and to clamber up the ladders in droves. In fact, it's said that so many men jumped onto the ladders that they broke under the weight, and only Peucestus, Leonatus, Aristonus, and Timaeus managed to reach the walls before the ladders were lost. They, too, leapt down and positioned themselves around their fallen king. It's said that, comforted by their presence, Alexander finally gave up the effort and collapsed unconscious. The 4 men now took up the fight, even as the Malians from the outer walls swarmed the site, hearing that Alexander was vulnerable within their fortress. Timaeus was killed after a valiant fight, and Leonatus took a serious wound to the neck and fell to the ground, leaving only Peucestus, fittingly using, according to Arrian, a sacred shield from ancient Troy to cover Alexander and not himself, and Aristonus fighting off the Malian assault. Both men were already seriously wounded, but still fought desperately to protect Alexander. Of course, the remainder of the army had not given up their desperate attempts to reach their king, however. Without the ladders, they invented any means that they could to scale the walls. Some managed to drive pegs into the earthen walls of the fortress and haul themselves up. Others managed it by creating human ladders and climbing upon one another to reach the top. Those who made it also threw themselves down into the courtyard below and took up the defense of Alexander. Seeing their king down, they let out a loud cry, and the men still outside the wall, believing Alexander to be dead, became frenzied. They smashed through the walls with their pickaxes and swept through the stronghold, massacring everyone they encountered, apparently including women and children in their rage. Hearing rumors of his death as he lay ailing, Alexander resolved to immediately dispel them. He had himself taken on a boat to be sailed down the nearby river to the army's camp. When the men saw him move, they began to cheer. He called for his horse, and managing to mount it, it's said that the entire army applauded. Some even cried with relief. Craterus, one of Alexander's most experienced and capable generals, is recounted to have said to Alexander, quote, "Do you think that an enemy advance, even supposing that they were now standing on our rampart, would cause us more anxiety than does our concern for your health, on which, as matters now stand, you set little value? I shudder to think of what we saw a short time ago. I fear to put it into words. How those vile hands would have sullied spoils taken from your invincible body, had not fortune pitied us and intervened to save you. We who were unable to keep up with you are all traitors and deserters. You may brand the mark of disgrace on your soldiers, one and all. None will refuse to atone for the offense. But we beg you to save yourself and allow us to bear the danger which you so recklessly embrace." End quote. As they arrived to the last city of the Brahmins, called Harmatelia, Alexander designed to get them out of their stronghold by a ruse. He sent a small force against the wall, ordering them to retreat should the inhabitants make a sortie out. This they did, and the Macedonian soldiers made a show of a frightened retreat. The Brahmins, unsurprisingly, pursued them, only to be ambushed by Alexander with his full force. The Macedonians killed many and captured more. It was a quick skirmish in comparison to many of the previous battles, but it proved more gruesome and deadly than many others. As the battle came to a close, the Macedonians realized to their horror that their comrades who were wounded, even those barely scratched by enemy weapons, were suffering terribly. Diodorus explained, quote, "The body became numb immediately, and then sharp pains followed, and convulsions and shivering shook the whole frame. The skin became cold and livid, and bile appeared in the vomit, while a black froth was exuded from the wound and gangrene set in. And this spread quickly and overran to the vital parts of the body. It brought a horrible death to the victim." End quote. It seemed the Brahmins, realizing that they were outmatched by Alexander's forces, had dipped their weapons in poison derived from snakes that were killed and left in the sun. They had evidently hoped that one of them could reach Alexander and thereby dispose of the young conqueror. They failed to hit Alexander, but they did cause a superficial wound to the shoulder of Ptolemy, a noble, respected, and accomplished soldier and personal bodyguard, one of Alexander's closest friends since childhood. It's said that after losing sleep from worry, eventually the fatigue overcame Alexander, and he fell into a deep slumber, experiencing a prophetic dream in which a snake brought him the plant that could cure the poison. Upon waking, he sent his men to look for the plant, and when it was found, it did indeed manage to cure Ptolemy. Whatever the source of the knowledge, a medicinal plant was found that proved effective, and Ptolemy successfully recovered. Alexander then settled his army into the region to wait out the remainder of the winter and sent Leonidas to dig wells along the army's most likely route of travel. He also dispatched Nearchus, another figure mentioned in the Oralinda book, in conjunction with Alexander, with several ships to explore the ocean and report on its properties. For though Alexander was a relentless conqueror, he was also spurred on by a desire for adventure and discovery, and a general interest in the world. Educated in philosophy, as mentioned by the legendary Aristotle himself, Alexander maintained a keen interest in geography, biology, botany, and in his earlier campaigns he often sent samples back to Aristotle for further study. Among the numerous tales of great courage and heroism and exceptional generalship, it shouldn't be forgotten that Alexander was certainly not without flaw, and his was not a life completely free from blunder or mistake. Perhaps the greatest of these was the attempted passage of the Gedrosian Desert. Historians disagree as to how aware he was of its dangers. The celebrated Queen Semiramis had passed through on her retreat from India, and the story was that she emerged with only 20 survivors among her whole army. Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great was also said to have crossed the desert, and only 7 lived through the experience. Some even claim he was aware, and that it was ego that caused him to try to tackle this greatest of obstacles, and risk his men in so doing. If true, this certainly ranks as perhaps the greatest sin, in the ancient and broadest sense of that word, akin to missing the mark, of his unprecedented leadership career, and one that would leave him consumed with grief and remorse. Heat, lack of water, immense sand dunes which broke or bogged down men, animals, and carts alike, and the most inhospitable of conditions, all conspired to make this passage a hell on earth. To stay alive, men began to find any excuse to kill off and consume the baggage animals, and had to leave numerous compatriots behind, debilitated by exhaustion, heat stroke, hunger, and thirst, and there was nothing that could possibly be done to save them. Despite perhaps being directly responsible for their suffering, Alexander, true to form, still somehow managed to endear himself further to his men during the trials of the Gedrosian Desert, for he suffered alongside them through every hardship, pardoned them for acts of desperation, and supported the soldiers through his error. He even refused to ride a horse, thus joining his soldiers in trudging on foot through the difficult sands. On one particular occasion, he won further respect. A small group of men had wandered off to search for water and found the barest trickle in a shallow torrent bed. Gathering what pitiful bit they could into one of their helmets, they brought it to their king. According to Curtius, he accepted the gift and thanked them for their trouble. Then, with the helmet in his hands and everybody watching him, he poured its contents on the ground. The effect of this gesture on the morale of the entire army was as if every man had been refreshed by a draught of the water which Alexander had poured away. They were in this together, and if they didn't survive, Alexander would certainly be willing to perish with them, a fact I don't think any of his men had reason to doubt at this point. With Alexander and just 5 others summoning the strength to strike out ahead of the pack, they finally came upon a shoreline and a small source of fresh water and salvation. At long last, they'd made it. And though no doubt haunted by the cries of the scores of men they were forced to leave behind, fate had decreed that this remnant would live to tell the tale. One of the elements of Alexander's accomplishments that often gets overlooked is just how much territory he covered. Peoples like the Goths no doubt covered vast swaths of land, too, but because they moved as an entire tribe, in vast wagon trains, along with their women and children, their pace was always slowed accordingly. Alexander's force contained nothing but males of fighting age, of course, and because they'd often rely on surprise, it's said that many days were comprised of 18 straight hours of march. He was already well educated by some of the brightest minds in the world, but it might be said that these years of first-hand experience in navigating across much of the known world with an army in tow granted him one of the clearest understandings of geography, topography, and terrain, knowledge he'd make excellent use of to his final days. In a fascinating side story that seems poorly understood to this day, Alexander is given credit for the construction of what's been variously called the Caspian Gates, or Alexander's Gates. whose very location, even, is still debated to this day. The legend has it that the gates were constructed to prevent the passage of what was called unclean hordes. Depicted in ancient art with beaked noses, said to eat worms, dogs, human cadavers, and fetuses, it's all but impossible to separate fact from fiction. But it seems this may have been a reference to a people related to the Khazars, and or relatives of the Hunnish or Mongol people. An obscure account of Friar Carpini's journey to Mongolia in the 1240s is unique in alleging that these Caspian mountains in Mongolia is, quote, where the Jews, called Gog and Magog by their fellow countrymen, are said to have been shut in by Alexander, end quote. In the Borgia map, a copper-engraved world map probably produced in southern Germany in 1430, the most eastern part contains 2 fortified regions, depicting Gog and Magog, with the following Latin inscriptions. The province of Gog, in which the Jews were confined during the time of Artaxerxes, king of the Persians. Magog. In these 2 are large people and giants who are full of all kinds of bad behaviors. These Jews were collected by Artaxerxes from all parts of Persia. Scholar Peter Golden speculated that the Khazar ethnos was essentially a conglomerate of Turkic nations, including the Sabirs and North Caucasian Huns, as well as elements of the Gokturks. As Arthur Kessler puts it, the Khazars, quote, claim the status of a chosen race, even though they weren't descended from Abraham's seed, end quote, which seems reminiscent of the similar Edomite or Idumean peoples who largely took over the temple in Israel, as well as the label Judahite after their forced conversion by John Hyrcanus in the 2nd century BC, which has subsequently morphed into the modern term Jew. The author of the fanciful Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a 14th century bestseller, said he had found these Jews in Central Asia, whereas Gog and Magog, they had been imprisoned by Alexander, plotting to escape and join with the Jews of Europe to destroy Christians, one of the works which gave rise to the legend of the Red Jews, or Rote Juden, in Middle Ages Germany. In the Alexander Romance, another fanciful tale, it simply recounts them as a, quote, race of heathens, purposefully enclosed behind a great wall. This biblical term of Gog and Magog has become so convoluted and muddled as to be rendered almost useless. But it did seem to be believed that these gates were constructed to keep out a people similar to those famous or infamous groups so responsible for pushing the Germanic peoples ever further west throughout the ages and wreaking havoc on their nations. Not merely through the rampaging, mixed and mercenary armies that seemed endless in number, but from inside as well, through schemes, court intrigue, and bribery. The 9th century monk Christian of Stavelot said the Khazars were, quote, living in the lands of Gog and Magog, and the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan spoke to the same belief. Quote, some hold the opinion that Gog and Magog are the Khazars, end quote. Some modern historians have attempted to argue that the peoples that Alexander wished to contain were the Scythians, but unless one stretches the definition of Scythians to the extent that they encompass the Turkic and Mongol and Khazarian forces that moved into their territory after they'd begun their mass migration westward, as some modern historians unfortunately do, this claim seems a bit ridiculous. Additionally, it's recounted that peoples like the Alans and other Scythian relatives and offshoots were always allowed free passage, and Alexander seemed to have a great respect for the Scythians and their related Gothic and Sakai or Saxon people groups, and this seems to have been largely mutual. Philip married a daughter of the Gothic king Gudilla. It's said that in the east, Alexander reformed his army and took into his special forces mainly peoples belonging to the Sakai and Scythian tribes. And it's said that from an early date, Alexander incorporated Scythian horsemen into his famous phalanx, and in fact, copied the famous wedge-shaped military formation from the Scythians. As mentioned, the great leaders Porus and Taxila in India, who so earned Alexander's respect, were almost certainly of the direct lineage of the Sakai, and from these ancient Sakai, in turn, almost certainly descend the Saxons and later Anglo-Saxons and related peoples. To quote Victor Rydberg's Investigations into Germanic Mythology, quote, "From the Longobardians, I now pass to the great Germanic group of peoples comprised in the term Saxons. Their historian, Widukind, who wrote his chronicle in the 10th century, begins by telling what he has learned about the origin of the Saxons. Here, he says, different opinions are opposed to each other. According to one opinion, held by those who knew the Greeks and Romans, the Saxons are descended from the remnants of Alexander the Great's Macedonian army. According to the other, which is based on native traditions, the Saxons are descended from Danes and Northmen." End quote. And speaking personally, I tend to believe both of these opinions are potentially true to varying degrees. The Macedonians themselves were not just geographically near, but seemed to have a fair bit in common with the wilder, non-royal steppe Scythians on their borderlands. And though they certainly sparred, with Philip, in fact, being one of the few to briefly best them, with the killing of their king Aetius, who apparently took to the field of battle at the impressive age of 92, the mutual respect evidenced throughout the historical record is clear. As the dust settled, and with the passage of time, as nations and empires rise and fall, as populations migrate and the geopolitical scene changes and evolves, it's the stories and legends that best stand this test of time. Although there are some intriguing genetic and cultural anomalies worth noting. It's said that this large army of Alexander's, containing both Macedonians and auxiliaries from several kindred and allied peoples, left several traces along their path, still visible to this day to the discerning eye. The Hunza people are rumored to be descended from Alexander the Great's army, and are famed for living extremely long, healthy, simple, and happy lives, and for being able to conceive, apparently, well into their 60s and 70s. The Kalash people, because of their higher frequency of fair skin and blue eyes relative to their neighbors, coupled with legends and cultural traditions of significant numbers of Alexander's men settling in the region, has led to a popular hypothesis that several of their descendants were indeed Alexander the Great's soldiers who followed him on his campaign in India. Fascinatingly, a genetic study by Hellenthal in 2014 seems to show a genetic connection between the Kalash and modern Austrians and Germans. Because they're currently landlocked in an Islamic and thus fairly hostile region, a religion to which they've steadfastly refused to convert, they're also a rapidly disappearing people, but are said to retain their pride and sense of identity nonetheless. Further proof of the power and mystique of this great conqueror and his seemingly invincible armies, that even the hint of genetic or cultural ancestry might shape a people's notions of themselves across millennia. In 323 BC, at the young age of 32, Alexander fell mysteriously ill and languished in bed, likely in agony, for nearly 2 weeks. His inability or unwillingness to clearly name a successor shouldn't be surprising. To a personality like Alexander, a quiet death in bed after all he'd been through likely seemed impossible, and the mere discussion of such a possibility perhaps insulting, defeatist, or seen as a bad omen. The phrase, "after me the deluge," comes from the French king Louis XIV, but I've always felt this sentiment may have just as well been expressed by Alexander. Chaos would become the defining theme of the coming decades and centuries, as it so often is when great men leading vast empires pass away without leaving a clear roadmap. On his deathbed, some historians claim that when he was pressed to name a successor, Alexander muttered that his empire should go, quote, "to the strongest." Other sources claim that he passed his signet ring to his general, Perdiccas, thereby naming him successor. But whatever his choices were or may have been, one thing is certain: no clear succession plan was followed. Alexander's generals, all of them with the loyalty of their own armies at their back, would proceed to tear each other apart in a vicious internal struggle that lasted almost half a century before 4 factions emerged victorious: Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire in the east, the Kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor, and the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. During the course of these wars, Alexander's only heir, the posthumously born Alexander III, was murdered, along with his mother, who both fell to poisoning, extinguishing his bloodline forever. I've always been a bit stunned and baffled at the inclination of modern historians to discount the possibility of poisoning being the cause of his own death. Alexander had spent a lifetime brutally punishing traitors, schemers, and intriguers. And considering the story of Bagoas and the endless series of poisonings in Persia, which of course now was part of his own empire, and considering that even the Macedonian court itself was beginning to fall victim to this disgusting behavior throughout Alexander's days, the idea that this man with the robustness of a Rasputin and a guardian angel that seemed to work overtime throughout every moment of his life could simply pass away bedridden in the prime of his life because of too much wine, or the sudden onset of some mystery disease, seems to me far less believable and logical than the theory of foul play. To give voice to my own intuitive speculation here, with emphasis on speculation because these waters are even still as murky as ever, I do believe he was probably murdered. With such an incredibly high percentage of the foremost men all around him during his lifetime and just after, meeting similar, sudden mysterious deaths, and with Alexander being without a doubt the foremost target of the jackals who use such methods to worm their way up the ladders of power and influence, this seems to me the more likely case. After years of dismissing the idea, at least a portion of relevant academia is beginning to come around. A Dr. Shep and a Dr. Pat Wheatley of Otago University published a paper in the medical journal Clinical Toxicology making a plausible case for the type of poison that may have been used, one that produces the physical effects mentioned in the accounts of Alexander's last days, and one known and available to the men of his age, called white hellebore. This could have been slipped into his wine, and with a bit of sweetening to hide the bitterness, may have gone largely unnoticed until it was far too late. As history so clearly attests, it's not enough for great men to destroy, they must create, have a vision for something new to take the place of the old order, or chaos, they've brought down. I tend to believe Alexander had a plan, and God only knows how the implementation of this vision might have changed the world, not simply in Alexander's day, but all the way up to our own. The cascading butterfly effects would have had an enormous, incalculable impact. Perhaps this plan was a threat or a diminution of power to certain hidden hands behind the scenes. As for who might have been behind such a murder and what their specific motive may have been, this stands as a massive looming question mark, perhaps never to be answered to satisfaction. And after all, the very purpose of any successful conspiracy is to covertly accomplish a deed and get away with it. I suspect that the vast majority of conspiracies throughout history remain wholly unknown and undiscovered. But this is a topic for another day, and it doesn't seem fitting when telling the story of a truly great man to focus too intently on the far smaller and lesser men, the envious or parasitic types that nipped at his heels until perhaps causing his demise. It seems somehow fitting that this cowardly and scheming final act took place in Babylon. For all of his faults, Alexander the Great was one of the most capable soldiers, leaders, strategicians, conquerors, and organizers and uniters of men to ever live. A man magnanimous and just to courageous foes, a despiser and punisher of cowardice and treachery and disloyalty. And this is how you separate out a noble conqueror from a mere scoundrel with an army. History is replete with examples of his opposite type, who, when a great enemy warrior is finally brought to heel after wreaking such havoc, let their emotion and petty anger blind them, and either killed or tortured or otherwise mistreated the courageous hero or leader whose only fault was his bravery and competence on the battlefield. Alexander, however, didn't just show courage himself, he genuinely respected it in his foes. He was a man who avoided the blinders and narrow focus of many martially minded men who came before and after him, who sincerely respected the noble sage, teacher, or priest, wherever he found them. His comment to Diogenes, "Were I not Alexander, I would be Diogenes," not only strikes me as probably historically accurate and truthful on Alexander's part, but seems to speak to his character and orientation, and his innate respect for knowledge and wisdom and the truly wise man, and his all-important role. In many ways, Alexander seems to fit the more ancient and lofty definition of genius, a genius that just happened to choose the martial path in his lifetime, no doubt feeling pushed by necessity and environmental conditions to do so. Despite being typically outnumbered, at times by a ratio of 2-to-1 or more, he's said to have never lost a single battle. Without a doubt, there are lessons to be learned from the life and the death of this lion among men. And one of the most important of these is in just how clearly he contrasted with his opposite type. As Persia began to fall ever further into the hands of lesser men, her leaders, like Xerxes, took to going to war with a massive procession in tow, including dancers and court eunuchs and feasting tables, ensuring the leaders could indulge in every luxury and vice imaginable, and live in extreme ease and comfort as they sent their massive bought armies to fight and die. Alexander, on the other hand, cultivated a highly trained, highly mobile force capable of brutally effective blitzkrieg tactics. And Alexander himself not only led the fighting, but quite literally couldn't help himself from personally plunging into the thick of it, perhaps knowing that he could dictate the pace and flow of the fighting by doing so, due to his soldiers' love for him and desire to keep him safe at all costs. While other conquerors used their victories to spitefully punish the most successful individual warriors or the most valiant nations or peoples, and applauded treachery whenever it might benefit them, Alexander had a deep innate respect for the capable warrior and for courage itself, regardless of whether these traits were possessed by friend or foe, and despised treachery and disloyalty, and went out of his way to punish those responsible, even when the treacherous actions stood to benefit him. More than anything, Alexander seemed fundamentally honest and forthright in his approach. While court intrigue and scheming eunuchs made use of poison and conspiracies to work from the shadows, Alexander, mounted on his trusty steed at the head of his men, basked in the sunlight and open air, spoke his intent clearly and openly, and followed through on his threats and promises. He would spend a mere 32 years on this earth, and yet managed to live every last one of them to its fullest. And in doing so, reoriented our collective vision of what's possible, and left a lasting imprint on the human psyche that will never fade. Much respect. May the mortal shell rest in peace, and the spirit of the man, and the legend it left in its wake, live on.